Hi everyone. Today I am recording this video on the causes of the Russian Revolution. It will be a short video, that's my goal. Basically going over the most fundamental causes, again, of the Russian Revolution. Before we get started with that, a few things. Number one, we last left off in world history with the effects of World War I. You watched a very short video from Crash Course right before the break, and I want to just bring that back into your memory, if we could take just a second for that. There are many effects of World War I, and we went over just a few of them in the video. It was a very short video, but it was packed with 7 different effects of the First World War, and I have just a few of them on the screen just as a reminder. One, you can see is the supremacy or the emergence of the United States as a global economic and military power. There were other effects in the social arena. We talked about women gaining the right to vote in previous chapters, if you remember, following World War I. On the bottom left, you see the reflections of the new mentality of cynicism that emerged from World War I, as reflected in the art of the time, not just the paintings, but also the literature of people like Ernest Hemingway, the so-called Lost Generation. There were many effects for Europe as a whole. The major empires, like the British and French Empire, were weakened by the amount of money and manpower they lost in the war. And the other empires, the German, Austro-Hungarian, and Russian empires, were ended. And 2 of those by the Treaty of Versailles and the other various treaties that ended the war, meaning Austria and Germany, and the Russian Empire. And that's the one that we're going to really focus on today and as we move forward. In the video, you saw the 2 brief clips on the Russian Revolution. One being the initial February Revolution, and we'll talk about that today. And then the second being the so-called October or Bolshevik Revolution. So this, on the right side, the February and October revolutions, are the ones that we want to get into today, and we want to see what caused those revolutions to take place. One of the things that we want to make sure we understand is that World War I is very, very tied into the origins of the Russian Revolution. The Russia had a lot of underlying problems that were affecting it at the time, and we'll get into those more individually. But one of the problems was that Russia was a huge empire with many different national groups. About 100 million people lived in the Russian Empire at the time. About half of them were ethnic Russians, and the other half were basically 2 dozen different ethnic groups and of various sizes that were part of the Russian Empire. And so Russia had a perpetual problem of keeping those different national groups under control. And so World War I was partially Tsar Nicholas's goal. One of the goals was to unify Russia with the appearance of a common enemy. We've seen this before in history, and it's a very common occurrence where a war might unify, or external threat might unify people that were otherwise at odds. Okay, this did not go so well for Russia, and we'll see why. But the short answer would be, if you're going to use a war to accomplish something, then you had best win the war. And we'll talk about how that goes for Russia more in a minute. So the Russian Revolution is in your book in chapter 30, section 1. We are going to assess this material similarly to how we did World War I, where you had an Edpuzzle like this, and then you had a project which worked on the technology of World War I. That was a test grade, and then you had one other brief Edpuzzle Crash Course video. We're going to do something similar for the Russian Revolution, more on the assessment for this later. But again, we're going to be project based. We're going to be concept based. I wanted to tie this to the book so that you can go back and look and read where this information is if you are interested in it, in fleshing it out, or if you're confused by anything. But remember, we're only going through the bare essential necessary facts that I want you to know moving forward. And in this case, the Russian Revolution, we'll look at it as causes and effects. This is the cause video, and we'll do a short assignment on the effects of the Russian Revolution later. There are 5 causes we can briefly look at today that I have listed here. Autocratic rule, that's probably going to be the one that we spend the most time on, and we'll talk about what that means. The legacy of the feudal social structure and rapid unequal industrialization, 2 and 3 are related topics that revolve around their economic situation in 1917 when the revolution started. And then the final 2, 4 and 5, the failed foreign wars and internal resistance, the beginnings of the revolutions themselves that led up to the October 1917 revolution. Those are also related to each other. So we'll kind of go through these all today in brief. We'll start with a map of the Russian Empire. The Russian Empire, just to make sure we understand when we get into the and I mentioned this earlier, this is a huge empire. Physically, in terms of actual space, it's from Europe all the way to the Pacific Ocean. You have borders on one side of Poland and Germany, and on the other to Japan. And this by itself would create huge problems that the Russian czars would have to try to overcome. Remember, this is all during a time that mass communication, rapid transportation was very, very, very limited. In fact, we'll talk about the beginnings of the Trans-Siberian Railroad and how that connected the one end of Russia to the other, but that was only completed in 1900, which was only 17 years before the revolution began. If you notice the dates on most of these conquests, it was all done by 1894, and the railroad wasn't finished. It wasn't finished until 1900. So try imagining ruling a country this size with the various different ethnic groups, and that's another reason I want to look. You can see examples here. We have Kazakhstan down here, and Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Ukraine, Poles, Germans, right? You have all kinds of different ethnic groups that operate in this empire, and for the most part, we're seeing that there only one ethnic group, the Russians, and only one Russian, the Tsar, is in charge of all of it. And so it's a very diverse empire. It's a very large empire, and that's the first step that we need to understand. So how does this Tsar rule such a large empire? And we have to understand a few things, and I have a list of methods there. The Tsar was an absolute monarch. Just like Louis XIV, we talked about earlier in the year, he was the sole ruler of Russia. That entire map you just saw and all the people that lived in it, 100 million people of dozens of different ethnic groups, were all ruled by one man. The Tsar relied upon the Russian Orthodox Church to help support him. By the time of the Russian Revolution, for the most part, the Russian Orthodox Church had a very tight relationship with the Tsars and his ministers, and was not totally trusted by the peasants that made up the vast majority of Russia's population. Okay? The second thing that is on that list under absolute monarch would be the concept of Russian-centric nationalism. Okay? We talked about how the concept of nationalism actually helped kings in England and France unify and control their kingdoms. But in this case, the Tsar isn't ruling just a Russian kingdom. He's ruling an empire that included so many different groups of people. To pick the Russians, above the others is going to create problems for the others, as you may imagine. Down below, you see methods of control. The Tsar used censorship. Basically, there was no freedom of press or speech in Russia at the time. You could be put out of business or jailed or worse by the government if you were caught publishing or printing information that went against what the Tsar's policies were. To enforce this type of censorship, you had the Okhrana, or the secret police of the Russian state. The secret police kept records on anybody that was seen as speaking out against the Tsar, and they would imprison, interrogate, and even execute people that disagreed or spoke out against the Tsar. Examples of this type of state. Down there at sea, teachers reported on students at the secondary and at the university level. It was expected that the teachers would, of course, they're teaching things that are inconsistent with what the Tsar wanted because of censorship, but also their students, if there were signs that the student was a revolutionary or potential revolutionary or had independent ideas, they might be reported to the Tsar or his secret police, rather. Okay. Political prisoners ended up in work camps in Siberia. These work camps were basically a death sentence. They were located in the middle of nowhere, and they would be kept in these political. And again, the only thing that you could do is if you spoke out against the Tsar. These basically you if you were accused of speaking out against the Tsar, you could be put into a trial by the secret police. You would be found guilty, and then you'd be sentenced the same day, and you could be shipped off to Siberia basically until you died. Very few people made it back from these camps. Other things that the Russian government did or allowed to control its population, there were pogroms. Pogroms were violent actions taken against Jewish communities that lived in Russia, and there was a sizable Jewish minority in Russia at the time. Pogroms could extend from anything from violence, like physically assaulting Jewish people, to destroying their businesses, to burning their villages, to murder and mass murder in some cases. The pogroms took place and were mostly initiated by groups of people within the Russian Empire that were willing to blame the Jews or were looking for a scapegoat for their terrible economic conditions. We'll talk more about what those conditions were in a minute. But in general, the pogroms were and could be initiated by private citizens. The institution, the Tsar and his police, would do very little to discourage or stop the pogroms from happening. I think the thought process was if the Jews were being blamed and targeted, then the Tsar wasn't for the situations that were going on. And then finally, Russification. This is a term that means that Russian-centric nationalism was an official policy of the empire, okay? That we would basically force people to learn Russian and, of course, convert to the Russian Orthodox Church. And we are going to promote the Russian culture in society above all the other societies and cultures within the empire, which the thought process being the czars were wanting to benefit from that nationalism. We said the French monarchs and English monarchs benefited from the nationalism that was rising in the 1600s and in 1700s in England and France and Western Europe. What the czars wanted to do was basically take that same concept of nationalism in general, helped those kings consolidate rule. They wanted the same situation in Russia. And since they didn't have a nation just with Russians, they wanted to make all the non-Russians Russian, if that makes sense. And of course, this backfires spectacularly. People don't want to be forced to give up their language, give up their religion, give up their culture, give up their traditions. And so this is going to actually backfire spectacularly against the the Tsar and his goals. Okay. Here's an example of what we mean when we say Russification. This is a modern map of Ukraine, which is an independent country today, but it was part of the Russian Empire for a very, very long time. And during its period of time as part of the Russian Empire, there were some examples of migration of Russians coming into what was the Ukraine, okay, and settling. And you can notice that the areas today with Russian as a native language are the areas closest to Russia, okay. The Russian language is a modern relic of this program of Russification, where in this case it was Russian people literally relocating into the Ukraine and settling there, bringing their customs and their language with them. But you can see the results that even today there are relics of this Russification program, even in the world today. And in fact, if you know anything about current events, over the last couple of years, the Russians used this map to help them annex the Crimea, which is down here at the bottom of the map. You might notice is a very high percentage of Russian speakers, and they use that as a pretext to occupy and annex Crimea back into Russia, which led to armed conflict in the Ukraine. It's been going on for several years now. So Russification is something that still has modern impacts felt today. Going back to the secret police, here's a couple examples of what we're talking about. The files that they would keep on citizens that were accused or found guilty of sedition, of treason, or speaking out against the Tsar or anti-Tsarist policies, or members of groups that were against the Tsar. They kept files on all these people, and they were watched constantly. You may recognize the person on the right. That's Joseph Stalin, and if you don't know who he is, we will get to him shortly. Okay. Next thing. All right. Russia's feudal legacy. We'll get into economics now a little bit. You see the list there. Basically, Russia was a society that hadn't moved past the feudal era. They're still basically at a feudal economy, and what that meant is you can see it right here in front of you. 10% of Russia's population of 100 million were the landowners, and they owned almost everything in terms of land. Almost everybody else was a peasant that worked on that land, and the land was they would pay rent, and in some cases they were little better than serfs. They very few Russians below the aristocracy owned their own land, so there was really no middle class, not even a middle class farmer. Most were serfs or little better than serfs that owed money to the landlord, to the nobles, and they really couldn't leave. Most were illiterate and had no pathway to increasing their social standing or their children's social standing or economic condition. And so this is creating a situation where you have a very limited, small group of elite people at the top that have virtually unlimited resources of money, and then the Tsar at the top of all that with his unlimited power in Russia. And then at the bottom, the vast majority of everyone else has zero power. They don't have money to spend on anything. They don't know how to read. They don't have any formal education, so they have very limited opportunity to do anything but farm. And these people are also they're never going to be able to be anything other than what they are. Okay, so that's the first thing we want to create, is this idea that the Russian society was very, very, very unequal, with a vast majority of people that suffered with very low levels of education and money, and food even in some cases. And then you have a very rich, very powerful aristocracy that controlled everything. The next step to this is industrialization. The Industrial Revolution began in the late 1700s in England, but as we remember, if you remember, the Industrial Revolution spread very, slowly and unevenly across different nations, and Russia was slow to industrialize. We just said that most Russians were peasants. The Russian government, the Tsar, actually tried to initiate kickstart the industrialization process by inviting foreign investors. I have that right there at the top. Foreign and direct investment. English and French industrialists came into Russia and spent money on building up factories, and in this case, the most direct, the most famous example would be the Trans-Siberian Railway. You can see that reflected there on the bottom right. The original route was that blue route that you see at the bottom that connects all the way to the purple route. So we have the blue all the way through to the, follow the blue line to the red and the red to the purple. That was the original route that was taken by this, and it was finished, like I said earlier in the video, at 1900, about 120 years ago. And so that was mostly invested upon by French and English investors. So that was one way the Tsar jump-started the industrialization process. But like we saw with other countries, in the beginning of industrialization, there's incredible inequality as the factory workers, you have child labor, you have low wages, terrible working conditions, a lot of those things that we saw happening in England. If you remember Elizabeth Bentley and that story, a lot of that stuff was happening in Russia too. And so now, even though we are beginning to industrialize to the point where, and you see that number 2, they were number 4 in steel manufacturing by 1900. So which makes them actually one of the top producers of steel in the world, which is a huge indicator for industrialization. So even though they had some success, they built this long, huge railway, they had a huge jump start on steel manufacturing. The reality is most Russians were still peasants, and Russia was simply so large that there wasn't an equal distribution of jobs, or there wasn't a very large middle class growing out of this. All right. Most Russians still lived as peasants, and even the factory workers that were now beginning to move to the cities were very, very poor, working in very terrible conditions. Okay. So this brings us to near the end, and we're almost done. If you add in the social problems, the political issues of having a totalitarian or autocratic state, now we got to add in the wars. And we started with this at the very beginning, talking about World War I, but there was actually 2 different wars that kind of initiated this kind of final terminal process to the end of the Russian Revolution, or to the end of the Tsars and the beginning of the Russian Revolution. The first war was the Russo-Japanese War. We actually talked a little bit about that before. It was in the packet for imperialism at the very end. It was one of the 2 wars that the Japanese fought in. One is that basically initiated their empire. If you remember the map at the very beginning, and I don't want to go bring it back here now, but if you remember, Russia and Japan were both in the same general vicinity on to the very far east of Russia, and so they were actually in conflict over influencing Manchuria. Long story short, the Russians lose the war, and this is humiliating for the Russians. They're a major European power, or they'd like to think they were, and they just lost. They're in the first country to ever lose to an Asian nation in this era in a direct conflict. So it's a humiliation for the Tsar and his army. And if you combine that with food shortages and other economic problems we talked about, it actually led to a revolution. And the very first revolution you see at the bottom is the Bloody Sunday, or the Revolution of 1905. On the right-hand side, you can see what happened was a Russian Orthodox priest led a peaceful march to the Winter Palace of the Tsar, which you see on the right-hand side of that picture. And the Tsar's soldiers basically opened fire on the starving people that were assembled before them. and that led to a larger revolution that that was ended by the Tsar making promises to the people that he would change, that he would make the government more representative, that he would listen to more people, and he would share power with ministers and a council. Because remember, he's an absolute monarch that hadn't shared power with anybody before. This revolution ends with the Tsar promising reform. I think a long story short, that reform basically was ignored once the revolution was over. He says it's almost as if he has his fingers crossed the whole time, and is saying, "Yeah, sure, we'll change. No problem. We'll start listening to you. I can change. I can be different." But as we know, people don't change very easily, and some people never change. So he goes back and basically returns to running things just as he normally had been running things before. World War I is the second war on the list there, and that's the nail in the coffin. World War I was a disaster. The Russian army was obliterated by the Germans on the Eastern Front. Millions of Russians were killed. The Russians had trouble getting equipment to their army. They had trouble getting food to their army. Basically, by 1917, the army was in open revolt. They mutinied, basically, and they quit fighting. They would kill their officers, or they would just walk away. They would walk away from the front, start marching home without orders or without any authorization. This leads to the March Revolution in 1917, with the army being defeated, and the other problems basically culminate with the Tsar being thrown out of power, and and that opens the door for the next stage. Okay. Last thing, and we're done. The March Revolution created a temporary or provisional government. The goal here, this provisional government was at this point, they are eliminating, the Tsar is still alive, and his family's still alive, but they are no longer in power. Okay. And this provisional government is going to try to basically run things until a new government, a permanent government, could be formed, which is great. All right, except for, and this is the big problem that they had, was right there at number 2. They continued Russia's participation in the war, hoping that they could get a better agreement with Germany. They wanted out of the war, but they thought if we can continue on and maybe win a couple of key victories, then maybe we can force the Germans to sign a treaty that doesn't lose us a lot of money or land. But the problem was the Russian people were over it. They had had enough, and they needed to get out of the war, and they basically are willing to get out of the war at whatever cost. If that means a bad treaty where they lose a lot of land and money, the people don't care. And so this opens the door for the Bolshevik Revolution, which was begun. The book will tell you November. One of the things that might give you an indication of how slow and backwards Russia was is they had an outdated version of the calendar. They didn't update to the Gregorian calendar the way the Western Europeans did. And so they basically, because of the discrepancy in the calendar, it was still October in the Russian calendar when they began their revolution, but it was November in the Gregorian calendar. So you'll see in the book it says November Revolution, and then on the crash course video, at the beginning, you saw it's usually called the October Revolution, and because it was October of 1917 in Russia. It was led by Vladimir Lenin. The Bolsheviks were Marxists, and if you remember Marxism ideology, we talked about that before. I'm not going to review that now, but if you need to, you can go look it up. It's in the book and in the resources we've used before. But instead of having a general uprising of the proletariat or the working class, the Bolsheviks were a small group of revolutionaries. They were basically professionals. They wanted to initiate a workers' revolution, but they weren't workers really, or maybe they were ex-workers, but they were revolutionaries. Basically, that's what they did for a living. And so they led a factory uprising in November of 1917, or October, depending on which calendar we're using. And they overthrow the provisional government. they sign a peace treaty, and then later a permanent one called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk that ends Russian participation, and it is the Bolsheviks who take the Tsar and his family and execute them. And this will open the door to what eventually will become the Soviet Union. But we're not there yet, and we'll have to talk about what comes next later. So, that is it for today. I hope you now know the basic causes of the Russian Revolution, and I will see you the next time.